News of the Times. The Arsenic Exhumation. How Mary Bailey's body exposed a killer in 1863. In 1863, a quiet Stockport household concealed one of the most chilling arsenic murders of the Victorian age. A crime uncovered not by eyewitnesses or confession, but by the forensic science of the day. Mary Bailey, a woman of modest means and fragile health, died slowly and painfully in her bed after a period of care at the home she shared with her daughter and her daughter's partner. Her daughter, Alice Holt, insisted it was illness. The neighbours whispered it was something more, and when suspicions arose over a newly taken life assurance policy, the authorities ordered something rarely attempted at the time: the exhumation of Mary Bailey's body. What they discovered stunned even seasoned surgeons. Her remains were so saturated with arsenic that the body had barely decomposed 74 days after burial, a grim forensic signature that transformed a quiet death into a murder investigation. This episode follows the extraordinary path from suspicion to science. The impersonation used to secure a fraudulent insurance policy, the £250 of arsenic purchased for killing vermin, the Victorian physicians who pieced together the truth, and the confession that exposed pressure, coercion, and domestic terror. It is a case that reveals how desperation, manipulation, and poverty intertwined, and how the earliest forensic methods could speak for a victim who no longer could. Join us as we reopen the 1863 Mary Bailey arsenic murder, a story of deception, exhumation, and the forensic breakthrough that brought a killer to justice. And in today's end of episode further particulars segment, a jealous Victorian schoolmistress, a runaway lover, and a rifle loaded with blanks. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, as it turns out, especially when the rival she aimed at didn't actually have a heartbeat. And with our jealous schoolmistress having narrowly avoided committing manslaughter by mannequin, it's time to settle in. So, make yourself comfortable, tea at the ready, lights turned low, and join us as we step back into Victorian Stockport. Together, we'll follow the investigators, the physicians, and the quietly determined neighbours who refused to let Mary Bailey's death be dismissed as mere misfortune. Sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. The popularity of penny policies, insurance for the poor. To modern ears, insuring a relative's life for £26, approximate value of £3,700 in 2025, sounds almost trifling, but in the industrial towns of Victorian Britain, these small penny policies were both common and deeply significant. They grew out of a simple, unforgiving truth. The working poor lived without any cushion at all. A single illness, a lost week's wages, or an unsuspected funeral could push a family straight into destitution. Funerals in particular were ruinously expensive. The shame of a pauper burial loomed large in the Victorian imagination, and many families feared it almost as much as death itself. A modest insurance payout could spare that humiliation. It could keep a widow housed for a few weeks or prevent children from being sent to the workhouse. These policies didn't offer prosperity, only the smallest buffer against disaster. But for households surviving on the edge, that was enough. Insurance agents knew the emotional power of this promise. They went door to door through places like Stockport and Manchester, calling on mill workers' cottages, offering policies for just a penny a week. They marketed heavily to women, the keepers of the household purse, the carers of the sick, the ones who laid out the dead. For many mothers and daughters, paying the weekly premium felt like an act of responsibility, even love. For this same system was vulnerable to abuse. Policies could be taken out without the knowledge or consent of the person being insured. Identities were easily blurred, and in the poorest neighbourhoods, an insurance paper appearing just before a sudden death was enough to raise suspicion. Poverty created not only deception, but temptation. And in the case of Alice Holt, the taking out of that small policy worth little more than a labourer's months of wages would become the thread that unravelled the entire crime. Arsenic in 1863, the everyday poison hiding in plain sight. To a modern audience, it seemed extraordinary that a lethal substance like arsenic could be purchased over the counter in Victorian Britain. But in 1863, arsenic occupied a strange place in everyday life, both feared and utterly ordinary. Arsenic was everywhere. It was used to kill rats in crowded industrial towns, to treat sheep for parasites, to preserve taxidermy specimens, to stiffen fabrics, to produce vivid green dyes, and to make flypaper. In poorer neighbourhoods, people genuinely needed it. Vermin were a constant threat. A rat infestation could destroy food stores, contaminate water, and spread disease within days. For many Victorians, the fear of vermin was almost ancestral. Britain had not forgotten the centuries when rats helped to carry plague through crowded streets. In such communities, arsenic felt less like a poison and more like a necessary weapon. The law had already recognised the dangers of arsenic. After a series of notorious poisonings in the 1840s and 1850s, Parliament passed the Arsenic Act of 1851, requiring chemists to record sales in a register, take the purchaser's name and address, and, in theory, only sell arsenic if it was coloured, usually with soot or indigo, to prevent accidental ingestion. Children were no longer allowed to buy it, and chemists were advised to ask questions if a buyer seemed suspicious. But this was Victorian Britain, a world of minimal oversight and vast social inequality. In practice, enforcement varied wildly. Chemists were often busy men with little time or inclination to interrogate a customer buying poison for killing rats. Many did not bother colouring the arsenic, finding the process inconvenient. In working class districts where rat poison was purchased constantly, shopkeepers tended to accept familiar explanations without scrutiny. If a housewife claimed she needed arsenic for vermin, very few questioned her. There was also a cultural blind spot. The middle classes worried about genteel poisoners slipping arsenic into food, and the authorities worried about accidental deaths, for murder or for insurance. That seemed almost unthinkable to them until cases like the Alice Holt case began to expose how vulnerable the system really was. And so in 1863, a woman like Alice Holt could walk into a shop in Stockport, request a £1/4 of arsenic for killing bugs, sign a ledger no one ever inspected, and leave with enough poison to kill an entire street, all for a few pennies. Arsenic was easy to obtain because life for the Victorian poor was hard. The law existed, but the need for pest control, combined with weak enforcement and the pressures of daily survival, meant that deadly substances still flowed freely through the working class home. In Mary Bailey's case, that accessibility proved fatal. This case begins not with whispers about the suspicious death of Mary Bailey, whose passing had already been neatly certified as an unfortunate bout of bowel inflammation by the parish surgeon, but with something far more prosaic: insurance fraud. In 1863, small insurance policies were taken very seriously indeed. For many working families, a burial fund was the only safeguard against the shame of a pauper's grave. So, when word reached the police that someone had impersonated an elderly woman to secure a £26 life policy, the matter was promptly investigated. What began as a question of paperwork quickly unravelled into something darker. As officials traced the signatures, the witnesses, and the circumstances of Mary Bailey's sudden illness, the tidy explanation of natural death began to collapse, and when doubts grew strong enough to justify the rare and solemn act of exhumation, the truth came to light with horrifying clarity. A fraud inquiry had become a murder inquiry, and Mary Bailey, who had seemed to slip away from natural causes, would speak again, her body revealing through the new science of toxicology the unmistakable fingerprints of arsenic. From the Stockport Advertiser and Guardian, the 12th of June 1863, a suspected case of poisoning. In our journal on the 29th appeared a report of Alice Holt, a widow who was committed for trial by the borough magistrates on the charge of obtaining from the Wesleyan and General Life Insurance policy by false pretences, that is, by impersonating a healthy person as a certificated member for her mother, who was sick at the time. Since her removal to Knutsford, rumours of a strange character have prevailed in the neighbourhood of Great Egerton Street and Bridgefield, imputing that Mrs. Bailey, Holt's mother, had died by foul means for the purpose of getting speedy possession of the club money, 2 payments only having been in fact made. Mr. Superintendent Moores of the Borough Police, assisted by the Inspector Walker, have now taken up the matter, and for the last day or two investigations about the truth of these rumours, but with what success we cannot at present state officially. We find, however, that the prevailing rumours within the neighbourhood are so strong and circumstantial to justify in stating that the suspicions are grave and apparently implicative. On the 25th or 26th of March, Mrs. Holt is shown to have purchased 2 packets of arsenic from a druggist in Heaton Lane, she being accompanied by a witness, and both averring it was intended to kill vermin which infested the house. At that time, Mrs. Holt had obtained a certificate of membership for her mother. On the 27th, the mother, after suffering most acutely from inflammation of the bowels, died, although visited by a medical man whose medicine was never administered. The daughter was in her mother's attendant during the illness. A surgeon's certificate to the effect that the woman died from inflammation of the bowels was delivered to the assurance agent, and upon the current faith of that document, the money was immediately paid to the daughter. The purchase of the poison, the arsenical appearance of the body, and the sufferings anterior to death are now for the first time remembered, and the officers of justice, having taken the matter in hand, the antecedents of the accused being of a very unfavourable character. The depositions of several witnesses have already been taken, and upon that prima facie evidence, the coroner has issued his warrant for the exhumation of the body, which lies in Brunswick Chapel Yard. What began as a routine suspicion of insurance fraud soon gathered speed. The authorities ordered an inquest. A formal examination meant simply to clarify paperwork and intentions. Yet as witnesses stepped forward, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Neighbours spoke uneasily of Mary Bailey's declining condition and of a daughter who seemed curiously divided in her attentions. Shopkeepers testified to the purchase of arsenic twice in 2 days, in quantities far beyond what anyone needed to kill vermin. And the accounts of overlapping doctors' visits, each unaware of the other, only deepened the unease. Piece by piece, the picture darkened. What had seemed a sad but ordinary death began to look increasingly unnatural. From the Manchester Times, the 27th of June, 1863, shocking murder of a woman by her daughter. An inquest was held at Stockport on Saturday on the body of a female named Mary Bailey, suspected to have been poisoned by her daughter, Alice Holt. In the following evidence, the most important facts of the case are contained. Mr. Barker, assistant house surgeon at the Stockport Infirmary, said he was called in to attend the deceased on the 12th of March last, and accordingly visited her at her house in Great Egerton Street, Heston Norris. She was in bed downstairs in the front room. She complained of sickness, stating that everything she took came back up again. She also complained of great pain in the stomach and back. She became rapidly worse, the tendency on pressure extending over the abdomen. During her illness, she complained of numbness and tingling sensations and the lower extremities. These symptoms only continued for a few hours. The day the deceased died, Alice Holt came for a certificate as to the cause of death. Witness gave her the certificate stating inflammation of the bowels to be the cause of death. The day after, she brought the insurance ticket to sign. She told witness the body was turning black fast. When witness heard of the fraud, the suspicion of arsenic poisoning flashed across his mind. The symptoms under which the deceased was labouring before death were quite consistent with arsenical poisoning. Mr. H.G. Davenport, druggist from Heaton Lane, said he knew Alice Holt previously to her coming to his shop for arsenic. He recollected her coming to his shop on the 20th of March last, accompanied by Anne Bailey. Holt purchased £1/4 pound of arsenic, and she and the person with her made the marks in the paper produced before the coroner and marked M. She had been the same morning asking for a penny's worth of arsenic, but the witness told her he could not sell less than 3 pennies worth, and that she must bring a witness with her older than 21. The two women came again the following day, and Bailey purchased 3 pennies worth of arsenic, and each made their marks on the paper produced. It was white arsenic and was coloured before it was sold. Insurance agent Samuel Garlick testified that he had witnessed the original proposal for insuring Mary Bailey's life. He stated firmly that he had never told Alice Holt she could send anyone to stand in for her mother before the examining doctor. He had no idea that Mary Bailey was already ill at the time of the policy was taken out. Catherine Ryan, a long-time acquaintance of Mary Bailey, testified that she had sat with the deceased several times during her final days. Each time she visited, Mary was violently vomiting, tormented by unquenchable thirst and steadily weakening. Alice Holt was often present, but curiously detached. Ryan recalled one night in particular when Mary, exhausted from repeated bouts of sickness, whispered, "This is very hard work, and if I recover, I shall leave her." Mary then confided that Holt's partner had threatened to turn both mother and daughter out of the house unless she either mended or ended. Over the following nights, Ryan observed a troubling pattern. Mary drank whatever was offered, milk, wine, beer, or the brandy Holt brought, in her desperation for relief. But Holt behaved oddly with medicines, criticising one doctor as poisoning her mother, discarding prescribed doses into the ashes, and yet offering other drinks steeped with additional powders that Holt claimed to both her mother and Ryan were ground medicinal roots that required steeping in the drink. One cup of brandy and water in particularly caused Ryan unease. Holt scolded her mother for not finding the grounds at the bottom, angrily insisting she had paid sixpence for it. Mary died only a few hours later. After death, Ryan helped lay out of the body and noticed the skin was unusually discoloured. When she pointed this out, Holt burst briefly into tears and said it must be the convulsions. The testimony painted a picture not only of intense suffering, but of a daughter whose behaviour, evasive with medicines, irritable with the dying mother, and strangely fixated on the drinks she prepared, raised deepening suspicions. The revelation that Holt's partner had threatened to throw both women into the street unless Mary Bailey was ended or mended gave investigators something they had not yet possessed, a clear and chilling motive in addition to the suspected financial motive. And when Catherine Ryan described the final days of Mary's life, the relentless vomiting, the strange drinks, the discarded medicines, the fear whispered in the dark, the picture grew darker still. It was all circumstantial, yes, but it was coherent. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Yet nothing could prepare the inquest for what came next. When the coroner authorised the extraordinary step of exhuming Mary Bailey's body, 74 days after her death, the medical testimony that followed would transform troubling suspicion into something far more definitive. A forensic portrait of poisoning that no one present would soon forget. Mr. William Rayner said he was a doctor of medicine and resided at Heaton, Norris. On Friday the 12th of June he made a post-mortem examination of the body of Mary Bailey. He was present when the coffin containing the body was opened. The body scarcely exhibited any of the usual signs of decomposition which are usually found in a few days after death. The body had been dead 74 days. The face and body were covered with some extent with a bluish mildew, in patches varying from the size of a pea to that of a threepenny piece, which was easily wiped off. The skin remained firmly attached to the part below. The eyes were shrunk, but those who had known her during life might easily have recognised her. There was no smell of decomposition, nor the usual green appearance which in general is observed first on the skin of the abdomen within a few days after death. On the opening the abdomen, the stomach and liver and other organs were found in a perfect state of preservation. But on the right end of the stomach, a small portion of the leaf, which is there attached to the stomach and covers the bowels, was dyed a brilliant yellow colour to the extent of 2 or 3 square inches. Those portions of the walls of the abdomen which have been in contact with the stomach internally are dyed of the same yellow colour from contact with them. He then formed the opinion that these changes and the perfect preservation of the body were the results of arsenical poisoning. The surgeon removed Mary Bailey's stomach and found around 4 ounces of thick reddish fluid. When the organ was opened, they discovered white crystalline deposits clinging to the inner lining, unmistakably arsenic. Chemical tests confirmed arsenical acid, the form most commonly sold to the public. Further analysis revealed arsenic not only in the stomach contents, but throughout the tissues of the body. Even a piece of skin from the thigh tested positive. From just half the stomach and part of the bowels, the examiners extracted the equivalent of 210 grains of arsenic. In total, they estimated about 130 grains remained in the body. To put that in perspective, 4 to 5 grains was enough to kill an adult. The sheer quantity told its own story. Arsenic had been administered repeatedly, saturating the organs so completely that it acted as a preservative, preventing decomposition after death, the very reason Mary Bailey's body remained so eerily intact. With these findings before them, the coroner summed up. The jury deliberated briefly and returned a single stark verdict: willful murder against Alice Holt. With the inquest returning a verdict of willful murder, the case moved inexorably towards trial, and with it a clearer picture of the circumstances in which Mary Bailey had lived her final days. Both Mary and her daughter Alice Holt had been sharing a cramped Stockport home with Alice's partner, a labourer named Holt. Money was tight, tempers shorter still. Neighbours later recalled that his patience for supporting an elderly ailing woman was wearing thin, but throughout the investigation suspicion fell not on the man of the house, but squarely and exclusively on Alice. And there were reasons for that. It was Alice who purchased arsenic twice in quantities far beyond the needs of killing vermin. It was Alice who discarded the medicines prescribed by legitimate physicians. It was Alice who grated mysterious roots into the brandy and water she gave her mother on the night before her death. And it was Alice who quietly arranged a life insurance policy replacing her ailing mother with a healthy friend for the medical inspection, just days before Mary Bailey died. By the time the exhumation revealed the staggering quantity of arsenic in Mary's body, public opinion had already settled firmly on the daughter's guilt. The trial that followed was watched with unusual intensity in the local press, in public houses, and in the tightly packed streets of Stockport. For the Victorian working poor, this was a story that touched on everything familiar: poverty, illness, temptation, and the thin, uncomfortable line between survival and crime. And now, with the body's silent testimony laid bare, the courtroom would determine whether Alice Holt's actions amounted to desperation or deliberate murder. From the Manchester Times, the 12th of December, 1863, the Stockport murder. At the Chester Assizes on Tuesday before Mr. Justice Willis, Alice Hewitt, alias Holt, was indicted for the wilful murder of Mary Bailey, her mother, at Stockport on the 27th of March last. From the opening statement of the counsel for the prosecution, it appeared that the prisoner was a widow, and for some time before her mother's death had been cohabiting with a man named Holt, passing as his wife. The deceased was also a widow and resided with Holt and her daughter, Alice, the prisoner, at 43 Great Egerton Street, Heaton Norris, in the borough of Stockport. The prisoner was in poor circumstances, and she and Holt evidently regarded her mother as an encumbrance. Life insurance schemes aimed at the poor were fiercely competitive. In Stockport, and the Wesleyan and General Assurance Society was among the most aggressive. For just 3p a week, a policyholder could secure £28 on death, a sum modest to us, but significant to a family living on the edge of destitution. Alice Holt had been approached by one of the Society's canvassers in January, and by February, when her mother was suffering from bronchitis and too unwell to walk to a surgery, Alice agreed to insure her life. But when the Society required the insured person to appear before a medical examiner, Alice took a darker path. First, she asked a lodger, Anne Bailey, to impersonate her mother. When Bailey refused, Alice claimed falsely that the insurance canvasser had assured her anyone would do. She then persuaded another woman, Elizabeth Wells, to go with her to the office of the agent, Mr. Peter Scarlett, and presented herself as Mary Bailey. The deception worked. The medical certificate was signed, the paperwork approved, and on the 6th of March the policy was formally issued. The timing was striking. Only days earlier, Mary Bailey had been improving under the care of the parish surgeon. Yet within weeks, she would be dead. The infirmary surgeon visited Mary Bailey on the 12th of March and found her suffering from persistent sickness and severe pain across the stomach. At the same time, a lodger, Anne Bailey, was repeatedly sent out to fetch meat pies, always warmed by Alice Holt, and soon it became evident that everyone who ate them vomited afterwards. Despite alterations in treatment, Mary's symptoms did not improve. The infirmary surgeon noted that the medicines he prescribed were not being regularly administered, and neither he nor the parish surgeon realized that both were visiting the patient independently, a confusion that only deepened later suspicions. Mary Bailey died early on the morning of the 27th of March. The symptoms witnessed in her final days, violent vomiting, abdominal pain, and a declining unresponsive to treatment, were entirely consistent with arsenical poisoning, and not with the bronchitis originally assumed. In the days before Mary Bailey died, Catherine Ryan, a neighbour who often sat with the old woman, witnessed several troubling incidents. She saw Alice Holt take some of the prescribed medicine and simply throw it into the fire. When Ryan protested that she would never fetch medicines only to waste it, Alice snapped, "Hell to them and their medicine." Later that night, coming downstairs, Alice asked abruptly, "Is my mother dead?" Ryan replied that there was no sign of it, adding that it was hoped that she might yet recover. Alice dismissed this sharply with a curt "Tut tut, Mrs. Ryan." It also emerged that Alice had recently purchased arsenic from Mr. Davenport, the local druggist. After one such purchase, she warned Anne Bailey, the lodger who accompanied her, "Anne, you mustn't say anything about this." When Bailey asked, "About what?" Alice replied painfully, "About this arsenic." That evening, about 9 o'clock, the prisoner asked her mother if she would have some brandy and water, and her mother said yes. The prisoner then went out with a cup, and after an absence of half an hour, returned with brandy in the cup, but would not let her mother drink of it for some time, as she said she had grated a root into it and wanted it to dissolve. When her mother took the brandy, the prisoner seemed vexed that she had not drunk up the dregs, and this cup was afterwards found strongly impregnated with arsenic. When the old woman died, the prisoner went into Anne Bailey's room and said, "Well, Anne, I'm very glad my mother's dead. I've all my clothes pawned, and I wanted the money to release them. If she had not died, it would have been God help us." She also said that if she had not got the money, her husband, Holt, would have beaten her. On the 8th of April, Mr. Scarlett paid the prisoner £25, the amount of the insurance money. The body of Mary Bailey was exhumed on the 12th of June, after the insurance fraud came to light and neighbourhood rumours grew too substantial to ignore. The post-mortem revealed her remains were heavily saturated with arsenic, around 130 grams, more than 26 times the amount required to kill. Multiple witnesses confirmed the prosecutor's earlier statements, including Alice Holt's 2 separate purchases of arsenic in the days before her mother's death. Mr. T. Rayner, surgeon of Stockport, testified that he had initially treated the deceased for bronchitis from the 21st of February to the 1st of March, during which she had steadily improved. Later, however, she began vomiting repeatedly. He eventually refused to continue attending because he suspected another doctor was being called without his knowledge and because his medicines were not being administered. He stated firmly that the final symptoms were inconsistent with bronchitis and entirely consistent with arsenical poisoning. Mr. Walter Barker, assistant surgeon at Stockport Infirmary, confirmed the account already given by Mr. Rayner. Both men had attended Mary Bailey without knowing the other was involved, and both observed symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning rather than natural illness. Dr. W. Rayner then described the findings of the post-mortem he conducted on the 12th of June, 77 days after the burial. Remarkably, the body showed almost no decomposition, a classic effect of arsenic's preservation properties. The skin remained firm and the internal organs were unnaturally well preserved. Chemical analysis told the rest of the story. A stomach wash, tube number 4, contained 154 grains of arsenic. Even a fraction of this killed a test pigeon within 40 minutes. The solid contents of the stomach contained a further 160 grains. Arsenic was also detected in the cup from which the deceased had drunk the brandy and water mixed by her daughter. Dr. Rayner stated unequivocally that Mary Bailey died from arsenic taken internally, not from arsenic sprinkled about the room. The levels found indicated repeated doses over a period of weeks, producing the classic sign of chronic arsenic poisoning, relentless, excessive thirst. And with this, the prosecution's case concluded. With the prosecution's evidence laid out, the arsenic purchases, the suspicious conduct, the preserved body, and the overwhelming toxicology findings, the narrative seemed grimly clear. Yet in Victorian courts, even the strongest scientific proof had to survive the theatre of the courtroom. And now it fell to the defence to do the only thing they could to sow doubt, to suggest innocent explanations, and to urge the jury to look past the mounting circumstantial chain. Mr. Sweaterham addressed the jury for the defence, arguing that the entire case rested on circumstantial evidence. Strong suspicion, he said, but nothing that proved Alice Holt had administered poison. Were they really to believe that a daughter would fondle her mother with one hand and poison her with the other? He asked. Yes, Alice was poor, and yes, she had insured her mother's life, but was it reasonable to suppose she had then killed her simply to seize a modest payout? Sweaterham urged the jury to consider whether her behaviour fitted that one of a murderer. If Alice had been slowly poisoning Mary Bailey, would she really have gone to the trouble of applying for a union medical order? He conceded that death was caused by arsenic, but suggested alternative routes of contamination. Mary had drunk a great deal of milk shortly before her death. Could the jug have previously held arsenic solution used for killing vermin, and through carelessness not been rinsed before the milk was poured in? The defence rested on these possibilities, asking the jury to see not intention but misfortune. His lordship summed up very carefully, and the jury, after a retirement of about 20 minutes, returned into court with a verdict of guilty with the recommendation to mercy. Sentence of death was then pronounced in the usual manner, his lordship holding out no hope of its commutation. The prisoner, who was much more overcome when the verdict was delivered, kept feebly murmuring, "I am innocent," and "The Lord have mercy upon me," while the judge was pronouncing sentence, and she was ultimately carried from the dock in an apparently lifeless state. The judge's assessment left little room for doubt. Alice Holt had no hope of commutation. The weight of forensic evidence, the circumstantial trail, and her own conduct had closed every door. She was doomed to meet her fate at the hands of the notorious executioner William Calcraft. But before the sentence could be carried out, something unexpected happened. Alice Holt confessed. From the Broadsides, the 28th of December 1863. The unfortunate woman Alice Holt was not tried at the summary assizes in consequence of her being in the family way. The child has since been adopted by Holt's uncle, the only person who has visited her since her imprisonment. The prisoner Alice Holt has been sullen and strongly protested her innocence. The confession. On Sunday, the prisoner Alice Holt made the following statement. On the Monday before Mother died, I bought the insurance paper home, insuring my mother's life for £26 and money for £28. He, her partner Holt, then proposed I should get some charcoal and put it under Mother's bed alight when she was asleep, and she would never waken again. On Wednesday night, Holt and I never went to bed. He said he would be in a great release if she was in her grave, and he would buy some strychnine if I would give it to her. I said, "That'll be found out." He said, "They cannot find it out by that." I said, "That hast brought me to destruction, and now thou wants me to bring to the gallows." He then beat me. In the beer which I spoke of being given to my mother, I saw, after my mother had drank it, a quantity of the blue arsenic grounds. I said, "Thou hast given my mother arsenic." He said, "If thou tell aught, I will have thee up for defrauding the insurance." And he said, "Nobody will believe but what thou hast done it thyself." This was the only arsenic my mother ever had. The execution. The execution took place this morning. When near the drop, her courage failed her, and she was held, half dragged, half carried, to the scaffold. On the platform, she fell on her knees and moaned piteously, "The Lord have mercy upon me," which she continued to shout whilst Calcraft pulled the bolt. The drop fell, and the culprit, Alice Holt, was launched into eternity before a great many people, particularly women folk. The final judgment of Alice Holt. And so the story of Mary Bailey and her daughter draws to its bleak conclusion. The inquest had spoken. The jury had spoken. The surgeons with their bottles, crystals and tests had spoken even more loudly. And when the exhumed body yielded its unmistakable evidence, arsenic in every tissue, in every fold of preserved flesh, there was no refuge left for Alice Holt in law or in public opinion. Her confession, made in the shadow of the gallows, revealed a home cracked by poverty, coercion and fear. It did not absolve her, nor did the court treat it as mitigation. Instead, it laid bare the corrosive power of desperation. A daughter pressed on all sides, trying to please a violent partner and trying, in her own words, to avoid the very destitution that stalked so many in industrial Stockport. But Victorian justice was not concerned with wider circumstances. It saw only a woman who had poisoned her mother for a paltry sum, and who had done so slowly, deliberately, over days. And on the morning of the 28th of December 1863, before a crowd gathered in the cold winter air of Chester Jail, Alice Holt paid the ultimate price. The case left its mark. It shook the small insurance societies, troubled the medical profession, and lingered in the newspapers long after the scaffold was dismantled. For many who followed it, the true horror lay not only in the murder, but in the thin margins of life that had driven a family to such a point, where illness, poverty and pressure collided with the availability of a poison sold for a few pennies. Mary Bailey's body, preserved by the very substance that killed her, ultimately spoke more clearly than any living witnesses. And although that strange partnership of tragedy and science, one of the earliest Victorian toxicology cases unfolded, a reminder of the power of forensic truth in an age when so little else stood between justice and the grave. Further particulars. Today's further particulars brings you a jealous school teacher, a runaway lover, and a rifle aimed squarely at a mannequin. Miss Bradley intended revenge. What she achieved was the loudest, smokiest argument ever had with a wooden shop dummy. Even Victorian romance had its pantomime moments. From the Illustrated Police News, the 9th of November 1872, a jealous woman's revenge, ludicrous scene. A most remarkable case of jealousy and revenge reached us from Blyth. It appears that a young man named Walkinshaw, who is connected with a large London firm who makes mantles, skirts and bodices and other articles of female attire for the trade, paid marked attention to a Miss Bradley, a well-known teacher in a first-class establishment in this neighbourhood. For some reason or another, the Casanova in the case treated his former enslaver with coldness and neglect, and eventually turned her off for another and a newer flame. Miss Bradley was prey to the green-eyed monster. The demon of jealousy raged in her breast. On Saturday night last, she chanced to meet the gallant Lothario with her rival on his arm. Her head seemed to swim. She breathed with difficulty, but contrived to follow the loving pair at a respectable distance. A turning in the road, however, for a brief moment concealed them from her sight. Nevertheless, she followed them. Presently she observed young Walkinshaw enter one of the houses in an adjacent street. The people who rented the house in question were well known to her. She entered and followed her former lover upstairs. In the corner of the passage was a regulation rifle. Miss Bradley seized hold of this as a host of contending passions raged within her breast. Walkinshaw, unconscious of her presence, entered one of the apartments on the second story. Miss Bradley, rifle in hand, burst open the door and beheld her cruel lover's arms around the waist of what she supposed was her rival. She raised the gun to her shoulder, levelled the piece at the hateful object before her, and fired. When the smoke cleared away, the real facts were but too apparent. No mischief was done. The gun was loaded with blank cartridges only, and so far from embracing her rival before her very eyes, Mr. Walkinshaw was but trying the effect of a shawl on a dummy made of wood and canvas. How matters have been arranged we cannot at present say, but rumour says that the cases will engage the attention of a gentleman with a long robe. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. If you've enjoyed the journey, or if you simply survived it with your tea still warm, do consider giving the video a like. If you haven't yet subscribed, we would be delighted to have you with us. And of course, feel free to share this episode with someone who insists on brewing their own tea leaves properly, even when nobody's looking. If the elusive hype button happens to appear, do give it a tap. YouTube's little equivalent of Aladdin's cave, except with slightly fewer jewels and considerably more bafflement. And for those who'd like daily ad-free episodes of historical crime, murder, scandal and nostalgia, all seasoned with our persistently weak but well-intentioned attempts at British humour, you can join us over on Patreon, where the kettle is always on and the archives are vast. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, amateur antiquarian, part-time biscuit conservationist and full-time advocate for the collective storage of loose leaf tea. And finally, a small housekeeping note. Would the person who left out the cheese board and chutney kindly retrieve it before the cat discovers his inner gourmand? We thank you. Until next time, take care and stay curious.